Bodies of water. We're used to them. They play a role in our everyday lives. We live by Lake Michigan and the Milwaukee River, not to mention all the little ponds and streams we see in parks or gardens. But although we're quite familiar with these pools of H2O, we rarely stop to think about the microscopic world inside them. That's where this project comes in. This video will explain the massive variety of microorganisms right in our backyard, or in this case, in an inlet just off the Milwaukee River. Using just a microscope and a camera, we can enter the world of microscopy. Actually, we can't fully enter the world of microscopy. Microscopy is a broad term. It's the use of microscopes to study objects or parts of objects that can't be seen with the naked eye. But to better explain and classify the organisms we're about to see, we can use other categories. First, we have the prokaryotes. These are unicellular and lack organelles, which are parts in the cell that do specific jobs, like the organs in our own bodies. Then there are the eukaryotes, which can be unicellular or multicellular and have organelles. Lastly, we have the microanimals, the organisms that ride the line between micro and macro. Although these are multicellular animals and sometimes visible with the naked eye, they can only be seen clearly through a microscope. We can also group organisms by ways they consume nutrients. Autotrophs create their own food, usually through photosynthesis, and heterotrophs consume other animals for their food. And now for the main point, the microorganisms. Let's start out with the very bottom of the microscopic food chain, algae. This is Spirogyra, a genus of filamentous algae that lives in fresh water. These are autotrophs that photosynthesize to get their food, and are also multicellular eukaryotes, meaning their cells have organelles. Spirogyra and other algae play an important role in the aquatic ecosystem, turning sunlight into energy, but getting eaten by multitudes of grazers. One of these grazers is by far the most common microorganism in the Milwaukee River. Actually, the most common organism, period. Copepods. They might not be the first thing you think of when you hear most numerous creature on planet Earth, but here we are. These microanimal crustaceans live in any body of water with enough nutrients to sustain it, and can eat pretty much anything that comes along, from algae to bacteria to other zooplankton. The anatomy of a copepod is fairly simple. They swim by flicking their front antennae and locate prey using their one red eye. The females carry egg sacs that hold their young, and which eventually hatch into nauplius larvae. The larvae look nothing like their adult stages, but molt their skins as they mature. They're so different when young that the scientist who discovered copepod larvae, Otto Frederick Muller, actually thought they were a different species, as did I when I first laid eyes on them. But copepods aren't the only common crustaceans we see in the river. We also have a genus of water flea, Bosmina. Like all water fleas, it filter feeds using paddles on its underbelly, scooping up floating algae, bacteria, and edible detritus. The final crustaceans we find here are ostracods. These microorganisms have a simple anatomy and simple diet, feeding primarily on algae. Copepods, ostracods, and Bosmina all mostly reproduce asexually by generating exact clones of the mother. But a species has to evolve. So when times get tough, these crustaceans begin to sexually reproduce, which helps them adapt to their surroundings or at least pass on their genes. Bosmina aren't the only microorganisms that filter feed either. There are also stentors, huge single-cell eukaryotes. They feed by beating whip-like hairs called cilia around their mouths, creating a water current that draws prey inside. This is also how they swim and detach from surfaces. Here we have a species, Stentor caeruleus, whose striking blue pigment helps it sense sunlight. It can also regenerate tissue, even if drastically damaged. Cut a stentor in half, wait a day or two, and you get two stentors. So long as the organism has a piece of the cell membrane and macronucleus, which contains DNA, it can regenerate itself as though nothing ever happened. Stentors aren't the only organisms that feed by creating water currents. These Vorticella live in colonies and are a lot smaller as individuals, but still draw food into their mouths via cilia. So far, we've talked about the very bottom of the food chain and covered some middle ground, herbivores like ostracods and omnivores like copepods. But we haven't truly seen the top predators in this microscopic world. At least, not yet. This is a diaphanous worm, a gossamer thin hunter that searches for movement by inching along and exploring with its head. By now, we're probably used to seeing organs through clear microorganism bodies, but this worm actually doesn't have any pigmented ones. Instead, we see other organisms, including an ostracod and small copepod, which have been caught and are now being digested. And the diaphanous worm isn't the only predator around. Feast your eyes on the hydra. Related to sea anemones and jellyfish, this microanimal anchors to a surface and spreads out its tentacles, each one loaded with stinging cells. When prey hits a tentacle, it gets stung, stuck, and pulled toward the center mouth. The crazy thing is, hydras don't have a designated mouth. Every time they have to ingest prey or remove waste, they rip a new hole and then patch it again. Like many other microorganisms we've seen here, hydra reproduce asexually when conditions are nice and sexually when conditions get harsh. This is a hydra during asexual reproduction. They produce a smaller clone of themselves, called a bud, which grows until it breaks off from the parent. Although hydras can eat basically anything they can catch, they can only stay alive if there's enough to feed them. Imbalances in population and diversity can be deadly to every microorganism. Just like our macro world above, this microscopic biome of predator and prey is fragile, and the interactions between microorganisms are involved masterpieces. Most people aren't even aware of it. So next time you walk down to the river or look over a pond, realize there's more, much more, than the naked eye can see.